Welcome to this web lecture about the design and use of forms and dialog boxes. Forms are used when many fields of data must be entered, so that a complete user interface is needed for all the fields of data. Essential in a form is that all the input fields are available and visible to the user at the same time. So the display resembles what we are used to from paper forms. Few instructions, or if any, are required for many types of entries because we know how to use paper forms and it's just the same thing. Some entries on a form are actually a menu selection that we covered in a separate web lecture. This happens when there is no freedom in entering just any input, but only a limited number of options are available. To use forms, users must be familiar with the use of keyboards for entering data and the use of the tab key or a mouse to move the cursor between the different fields of a form. And the designer of a form should be aware that users will be navigating using the tab key, and the tab key should always move to the next logical form field that the user will likely want to enter. There should be error correction methods within the form, so you don't have to fill out the whole form and then enter submit before getting an error about entry in one of the fields. Fields should all be labeled with meaningful labels so that users know exactly what is requested. Sometimes there are problems when you are asked to enter an address, whether it's the street plus the number or the street without the number, and there is a separate field for the number. This can sometimes be confusing depending on the label that was used. Not every field is free text. So if there is a constraint on what can be entered, it should be clearly stated before the user creates the input. In another web lecture, we already saw an example from our OASE system that requires you to enter a date using a specific syntax, but that syntax is only presented after you use the wrong syntax and submit the form. But it's clearly an error in form design. Users should also be familiar with the use of the enter or return key. There are many forms where when you press enter, it submits the form and it doesn't just move to the next field. The common mistake that users make is that they think it does the same thing as tab, whereas often it does not. Here we see an example of a form that you're not supposed to be able to read, but what this form shows is that it is divided into different sections. So the structure of the form should be such that items that belong together, for instance, name and address information, they should be clearly grouped and separated from the rest. Also, what is perhaps not that clearly visible is that there are mandatory and optional fields, and the mandatory fields have a different background color than the optional fields. Such aspects of the form should be clearly visible by looking at the form without even reading any of the text. Form fields can have coded fields. So telephone numbers, for instance, they must very likely satisfy a certain syntax. The form should indicate exactly how that should be done. Same can be true for social security numbers, bank accounts, but they all have certain constraints that can be indicated on the form. Dates, similarly, money also indicate what is the difference in interpretation between a period and a comma, which is different in the European convention and the American one. Dialog boxes are also a kind of form, but dialog boxes are used for small amounts of data that need to be entered. They're often a combination of a menu and a form. There's some data you must enter, some things you must select. There are some internal layout and content guidelines to use, for instance, a meaningful title. Right? A dialog box that pops up and that says dialog box, right? That's always a very bad design. It should have a meaningful title and it should have consistent style and layout throughout the whole application. Every dialog box should look the same. Top left to bottom right sequencing. People in the Western world, they start reading at the top left of a screen. In a dialog box, they start reading at the top left of the dialog box and they go towards bottom right. And in the bottom right are the OK and cancel or yes and no buttons, right, to complete the dialog. Cluster items that belong together, just like in forums. Highlight items that must be entered. Consistent margins and white space, right, to have and consistent terminology. Always use the same fonts. Use the same convention for where you use capitals or not in the forums, right, to give a consistent look and feel that makes users feel comfortable, right, and make the interface pleasant to use. Use standard buttons. Do not invent your own buttons. There are standards not only for how they look like, but also for what they contain. If you have to confirm or cancel, right, it's always OK and cancel. Some other forums will ask you a yes/no question, right, which is different from OK and cancel. There is fixed meanings to all of this. There is an external relationship between the dialog box and the application that popped up that dialog box. Popping up and disappearance of the dialog boxes should be smooth. And you should choose wisely whether the dialog box must be closed after finishing the dialog, or whether you can keep it open in a non-modal dialog box. You can keep it open, you put it on the side. For instance, the insert symbol dialog box for Microsoft Office. There should always be a clearly distinguishable border and boundary between the dialog box and the underlying window. It should be clear what is the dialog box and what is the underlying window. Dialog boxes should also always kept small. If you need a screen full of dialog box, it's a form, it's not a dialog box. Right? The small size also helps you to still have access to the information that is on the window underlying the dialog box. And so there is room to move the dialog box to have access to the text that is hidden below it. Display dialog boxes always close to the appropriate items. Don't make the dialog box appear just anywhere on the screen or in a fixed location, but close to where you actually want it to appear as a user. Make sure there is no overlap in meaning between the required items, so that it's clear what to select. It should also always be clear how to complete the dialog. There are dialog boxes that give you no choice. Right? So dialog boxes that, for instance, say, oh, there is a disk error. And then the dialog consists of a single button that says, OK. Well, if there is one thing you never want to tell the computer when there is a disk error, it is to say that it's OK. There should be a way to say, oh, this is not OK. I acknowledge this, but it's not OK. Right? Often, these options are not available. Right? You are forced to say something you don't want. To conclude, here is a summary of advice for dialog boxes and forums. And when you are performing your final project and you hand it in, rest assured, we will check whether you took all of this advice at heart and whether your interface satisfies all these requirements. Thank you for participating.